The paradox of volcanoes was that they were symbols of destruction, but also life. Once the lava slows and cools, it solidifies and then breaks down over time to become soil. Rich, fertile soil. Matt Haig. Welcome to episode 5 of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and I'd like to thank everyone that has been listening so far. Last couple of weeks we've done some kind of metatextual episodes, just kind of discussing pop culture. This week we're going to get back into our prehistory and some of the major events in the last glacial period, right about the time we were leaving Africa or getting ready to leave Africa. Excuse me. There were some questions I did want to answer first. I have gotten a couple since our last episodes were recorded ahead of time. You know, we had like 4 in a row that recorded all around those same time periods, and I figured I'd go ahead and answer them now. So the first one was actually asked by a couple of people, including people I know in real life. But was there a male equivalent of mitochondrial Eve? And, you know, just kind of talk about that. So again, I'm not a geneticist, and that's not my area of study. But yes, there is a male equivalent of mitochondrial Eve. This is known as Y chromosomal Adam, and he's the most recent patrilineal common ancestor. And he is basically the most recent male from whom all living humans are descended through their male ancestors. This can basically only be checked, I think, through the Y chromosome, if I understand it correctly. I know, historically speaking, that it was assumed that this person would have descended from Eve, that he would have been much more recent. However, I think that started to shift once they discovered what haplogroups were for Y chromosomes. They adjusted the age of that estimate. I think right now he's considered to be much older than Eve, or not much older, but older than Eve in general, from my understanding. The other question was if I had ever seen, and this was related to the episode about Quest for Fire, and this was asking me if I'd ever seen the movie Iceman, which is a 1984 movie. I have not seen it. I've heard it's an interesting movie, kind of along the lines of Altered States, but it's not one I've seen. It's on my list. From my understanding, it's sci-fi though, so I doubt I'd ever do an episode on it, at least, in a traditional sense. But you never know. I might decide it's worth inclusion. That being said, I think we should probably go ahead and get into the main episode. So, as you may have guessed from the introductory quote, there is going to be volcano talk this week, and I hope you're looking forward to that. So let's go ahead and get on into it. Now, when we left off last time, it was about 80,000 years ago, and we were about 30,000 years into the last glacial period, and that means we have around 70,000 years remaining in that period of time. We're going to continue from there as we go over some of the more important cultural and material developments we made, as well as how we deal with some external challenges, we'll call them. Now, culturally speaking, in the archaeological record, we begin to see more evidence of burials that have more features to them than just saying, ripping up a hole and dropping a body in. When I gave an example of burial in the last main episode, I may have jumped the gun a little bit by giving those early examples of burial more meaning than, say, just disposing of, rotted remains and basically preventing the attractions of scavengers or predators. There is nothing in those burials that I'm aware of to convey any type of ritual or ceremonial component. I do think that there was, personally, but that's my opinion. So there's no evidence in those burials of any kind of ceremony or ritual. However, starting around 78,000 years ago, burials such as you'd see at the Panga Yasaidi cave in Kenya, which is a burial of a small child, we do begin to see and find additional and different funerary practices from the burials we found in the Middle East that date to 120,000 years ago. Things that include positioning of the body, and part of the body being covered in some type of wrapping. In South Africa, at the Blombos Cave, we found art that, or at least what is probably art. This is another big cultural development. This is dated to around 73,000 years ago. And basically what we found there are just like, they're just rough geometric lines and kind of abstract shapes. There's nothing too deep about them, but they are carved on ochre. And now this has been dated to around 73,000 years ago. Now there are older examples of kind of artistic expression, but most of those are questionable. There are things like handprints that could just be natural impressions that got captured and preserved by happenstance, or there are rocks that look like they could have possibly been carved or scraped to be like a figure, but then it could just be erosion that makes it look like that's what happened. There's no actual definitive shape there. But it's important to remember that these peoples that did the burial and these people where you're finding the first art in southern Africa at the Blombos Cave are just separated by 2 to 5,000 years. So that's a very big time frame, and it's Blombos in South Africa and Kenya are not they're not close to each other geographically speaking either. I mean, that's a long distance. I mean, I know they're both in Africa, but it's a trip. So not only are these people separated by geography and time, these people are not just separated by time, but they're also separated by geography. So they're descendants of one group and the ancestors of the other, or vice versa. They would not be interacting with each other regularly. Any kind of interaction between these two groups would have been completely peripheral, and this would happen, fairly rarely. Now, in between those two time frames, there was a teeny tiny massive supervolcanic eruption on what is today the island of Sumatra. There is a lake at the site today known as Lake Toba. This is the largest lake in Indonesia and the largest volcanic lake in the world. This explosion was stronger than the ones that blew, the top off of Mount St. Helens in 1980 here in the United States, and even the one at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, which, as far as I know, that's the largest one in the last 100 years in the world. So, in the 90s and early 2000s, we have the advent of DNA study, and there were some indications from, the samples we had at that time that there was a bottleneck in the human population that happened somewhere between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. So, the estimates of the time of that volcano's eruption and the impact it would have made on the world, they kind of line up. It was estimated at the time that there would be immediately cold temperatures anywhere between 3 to 5 degrees Celsius cooler, which is about 5.5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit cooler. For a half decade at least, and that would have had a major impact on the climate for, at least according to the estimates, for close to 1,000 years. So it doesn't take much of a leap to connect those two events. It would make sense for them to be related, and this has been a very popular theory. It is very well cited in a lot of online history sources, especially in like history videos that were made in the mid 2000s to the early 2010s, and it's something you'll see even in fairly recent, like within the last 2-3 years of online videos. That this catastrophe at Toba left our population at just around 10,000 fertile individuals. However, academically speaking, in the last 8 or so years, there has been evidence, or lack thereof, that show that this is probably not the case. So I have no doubt that the eruption affected, the climate to an extent, and it affected us to an extent. There is debris from that eruption from Indonesia to Africa. That's a lot. But there are missing things that you would expect from like a volcanic winter. There's no fossils in those, or there's not a large number of fossils in those like ash and eruption plumes, So there is actually little evidence that it led to our near extinction. So I think in March of 2018, there was a Journal of Human Evolution article. It was written by, I know the main author was Chad Yost, or at least he was the headline author. I think it was by a group of 4 or 5 individuals, but Chad Yost is the one I know off the top of my head. And basically they were showing that the dirt and other soil samples from that time show no real dramatic cooling event, at least in Africa, which is where most of us were living at that point in time. And it's important to note that it is possible. I've read some more recent, articles, I think, kind of responding to that the tropics actually would not have had as bad of cooling as, say, northern hemisphere, which of course most of our population was living in the tropics or the subtropics. So, that could be another explanation why we don't seem to be affected. But anyway. That's just the Toba event is very big, obviously in a geological sense. It was, I think it's still it's the most recent powerful eruption that I think we're able to track, and it's the one that we were alive in most recently. So it is a very interesting and compelling subject, and with a lot of worries about climate change today, it's something like kind of disaster porn, and like how it might affect us when the climate collapses, or whatever whatever you want to say about the current climate models, whatever those are. So, it's kind of like, we nearly went extinct then, we're probably going to go extinct now, whatever your take on that kind of study in science is. It's just like basically a dry run, for lack of a better term. But again, more recent studies have been a little bit more muted in the amount of change that was affected on the planet and on us. So if you see a video that's within the last 5 years and they're citing the Toba Catastrophe, maybe take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. Just as a little bit of a warning. Now, materially speaking, we do begin to see more items, or newer items, or at least finding examples of these newer items. Because again, my mantra is, if it's the oldest one we found, it means it's not the first one we found. It's just the oldest surviving example. So at that time, around the same time we were kind of developing those funerary practices, we've also found at another rock shelter in South Africa I think it's at Cebudu, we found evidence of construction of bedding from sedges, which are kind of like a fern, and they were topped with aromatic leaves that contained insecticide or larvicidal effects. So our ancestors are learning about a very rudimentary kind of pest control. So earliest pest control in recorded history. And from there, we have also found the earliest heat treatment of bladelets. So little, very small, chipped, carved stone heads for what are either atlatl darts or arrows. Now we've just found the bladelets. As far as I know, there were no pieces of wood that they were attached to. But obviously, just you having an arrowhead and throwing at something is not going to do anything. So they were obviously constructing these heads to attach to some type of wooden instrument. So we can guess that they probably had some type of adhesive or, maybe a natural occurring plant-based gel or tar that would allow them to attach these arrows or these arrowheads or bladed heads to either darts or arrows. Now that's at 71,000 years ago, and that's South Africa. Now, I did not go into atlatl darts when I went into when I mentioned them briefly in the Quest for Fire episode, because again, that's supposed to be 100,000 years ago. This is 71,000. So what an atlatl is, that's a term for what is a spear thrower. Essentially, it's a tool that you use to get leverage to kind of increase your velocity in a dart or javelin. And they can be very simple. They can simply be a long piece of wood that has kind of been cut in half and kind of pseudo hollowed out, and at the end you just have a hook or a divot in that wood that you did not cut away. Essentially, you just slide your spear into that, and then you just rear back with the thrower. So basically, you're throwing a spear, except the spear is not what you're throwing. You're using the same motion, but you're able to get a lot more force because you have that leverage, that extra leverage that you're getting from the thrower itself. Atlatl is a Nahuatl word, obviously, which was spoken in Mexico by the Aztecs, and that's how it's kind of come into use in modern times. Now, what does this mean for us? Basically, it would have allowed us to throw spears farther. You could have made deadlier tools from smaller pieces of wood, lighter pieces of wood. You would not have to get close to, or as close to your prey as you did in the past. There is some evidence, at least evolutionarily speaking, that once we kind of develop these ranged tools, we begin to see kind of a decrease in human size. We kind of get closer to what you would see in modern day hunter-gatherers in South Africa and in the mid deserts. You are not having to be as active, but you are also able to hunt much easier. So you don't require as much. You don't require as much physical strength. Being a super tall, fit, long distance runner like we discussed in those early episodes, that requires a lot of energy. You need a lot of calories. Well, if you can do that kind of hunting and bring down those type of animals without having to get close, there's no reason for you to be big and as powerful when you can be a little bit further away and just be faster. So, you probably wouldn't need, to kind of keep up that size in terms of your body. Not to say that they weren't fit, they're just not as tall, and their muscles are probably not quite as dense. Their bones probably wouldn't have been as dense either. And then with a spear thrower, I think you can get I think they've clocked it just like simple ones. At least I think it's 80 miles per hour, which is, I think it's like a little under 130 kilometers. I need to redo the math on that one. But, today, I think with modern implements, you can go well over that in terms of speed. So, that's... And it's also possible that we weren't using spear throwers at that point in time. That could have been a later invention, and we could have had the bow and arrow at that point. If we had the kind of adhesives we would need to properly, connect stone arrowheads to wood, it's entirely possible we would have had the technology to create very primitive composite bows. And these would not be massive. These would not be like full body long bows. We're talking about very small curved bows, just enough to kind of, maybe give you an extra 20, 30 feet on your range, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a hell of a lot better than getting within, strike like stabbing distance with like a 5-foot spear. I mean, that's incredible. So, but again, we're just not sure what those arrowheads were for. It may not have been a full atlatl or spear thrower. It could have been something smaller. It could just been like a little dart. That they were made. They were small, but they were easier to make aerodynamic. And then then they developed the atlatl or spear thrower from there. There's a wide variety of options for how that kind of happened. Whichever of the two, bow and arrow or spear thrower, that came first, this is going to be a massive boon for us in terms of acquiring food from animals, as well as protecting ourselves from animals, and it's going to help us outcompete our hominid cousins that are still around, of course, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans, whether we were trying to actively outcompete them or not, or if that was just the way things worked out. Ranged weaponry is going to be a massive boon for us in terms of just survival compared to those other hominids and animals. And that's what we're going to get into next time. However, this last little bit of this episode, I just want to kind of cover our breakout of Africa, at least in the initial phase. So we rapidly colonized what is kind of, I guess, southern Arabia, or at least we traveled through it fairly rapidly. We may have stuck around there, depending on what the weather was like. It would have changed. And I imagine migrations. They were following different animal herds. Just trying to keep up with them. They would have probably mostly crossed in the part of the Horn of Africa and Arabia, where today the Red Sea is. That probably would not have been there. There would probably have been, if not a small land bridge, enough of a kind of a small water crossing, something that could easily be made with some small rafts or something along that lines, just to get from Africa to Asia. And they probably would have encountered any remaining Homo sapien groups in the area, probably would have subsumed them if they had had the better technology, or at least, if not, outcompeted them or killed them, they would have probably, intermingled with him again. There were probably some humans in India, even before our starting point of this episode, which was around 80,000 years. There would have been very small numbers in India at that time. Even after the Toba explosion, which probably would have affected India, certainly, if not Africa. They may have kind of, the humans leaving Africa at this point, the 71,000 mark, they would have either moved in to Asia and India and intermingled with those groups, or it's possible those older groups had left, possibly because of the eruption, to try and kind of get somewhere a little bit more hospitable. Whichever the case is, by 61,000 years ago, so within 10,000 years of us developing microblades for those ranged weapons I was talking about, we had occupied Sahul, which is the term that some people use for the super Australia that would be connected to what is today like Papua New Guinea, Tasmania, and some of the Aru Islands. Again, water levels lower. They would have also had ended up in Sunda, which is kind of like the super Southeast Asia, which includes all of what is now Sumatra, Borneo, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, all those nice little Southeast Asian countries would have been, would have all been connected to one another, and there would have been less, a little bit less water travel. There would have been some. They probably would have made on simple log boats, burned out log boats, or maybe small rafts or canoes. So by 61,000 years, we had reached probably Sahul. If we hadn't by then, at least in small numbers, I think we were there. I think this is also known as Papua Land, or Magnesia is another term I've heard for it. Whatever you want to call it, that's incredible to me that we left Africa, and there were groups that just kept moving, just kept following, just following along, finding food, just surviving. And these people probably would have met Denisovans, the same way, our ancestors that moved into Europe met the Neanderthals. And that's kind of going to be our focus for the next episode. We're going to go in depth into the kind of peopling of Europe and Asia and our interactions with those other early hominids. And after that, I think that's going to take up most, if not all, of the next episode. And then from there, we're going to kind of wind down to the Neolithic Revolution and our discovery and domestication of plants as well as some animals, including, I think we'll get to the domestication of dogs next time as well. So I know there are going to be a few people looking forward to that. I thank you guys for listening to this episode. It's been a journey. Last couple of weeks have been some kind of lighter episodes. This one's kind of getting back into that more, kind of ethereal history. There's not a whole lot to know for sure. There's a lot of guesswork in these, and this obviously isn't my favorite part of history. I prefer more solid stuff and get into our discussion of the developments of different human civilizations and how they were like and how they were different. And we're going to get there. But I do think it is important to kind of see why everyone was where they were when we started developing, more identifiable civilizations and peoples and languages. So I think this is important, even though it's probably not the most exciting thing. But I do want to thank everyone that has kept up weekly. Again, I am very surprised at the numbers that I'm seeing. I mean, they're not massive by any stretch, but for just a fun little side project for myself, I'm not even including friends and family I know who have at least listened to one or two episodes. The numbers are still really impressive, even taking all that stuff to account. So I cannot thank everyone enough, and I hope you continue to listen and enjoy as the show continues and evolves along with our ancestors. So thank you all. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.